Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Unlimited. Today, we are talking about creating a human-centered work culture. This is the antidote to burnout culture. It is a reframing, a reimagining of the way that we do work. While it is particularly critical for leaders in organizations and corporations and all of those spaces, it is a process that is relevant to everyone, regardless of your work or workplace, whether you are an entrepreneur, a solopreneur, a nonprofit leader, someone who's taking a break from work, maybe even because of burnout. And unfortunately, you can't just leave a place or even start your own thing and get away from it. The patterns are all around us, and many of which we internalize without realizing it. Our work culture is pervasive in the way that we think about work and in the way that we think about ourselves in relation to work. So changing this is going to take all of us. And yes, the responsibility is much heavier on the people who are making decisions for many people. And we can all play a role in this shift. We all need to play a role in this shift. So no going, oh, she's not talking to me this time. I'm not in a workplace, or I'm not a leader in a workplace. No, it doesn't matter. There are so many good nuggets in here that are helpful for anyone, regardless of what your current relationship to work is. This is absolutely for you too. So to join me in this conversation, I've invited my friend and colleague, Marissa Badgley, who is the founder of Revolution, a consulting and professional development services provider that helps employers build strong, sustainable, and healthy workplaces with engaged employees, powerful leadership, and compassionate, heart-centered cultures. A globally recognized work culture transformation expert and facilitator, Marissa is driven by her own experiences of burnout and trauma in workplaces and has worked with over 100 companies and tens of thousands of current and emerging leaders worldwide to help them holistically and sustainably prevent what happened to her from happening to their people. She is on a mission to transform the world of work through the power of compassion, community, and heart. Revolution diagnoses the root causes of employee challenges and designs holistic interventions that drive impact, demand accountability, and meet the human needs of human beings. Marissa has been featured as a thought leader in publications such as Forbes, Business Insider, Thrive Global, Medium, and Crunchbase, and on podcasts such as Do Business Better, Small Biz Gone Viral, Welcome to My World, and Employment Law Today. And now on Unlimited. Some of what we cover in today's episode are why companies need an intentional culture, the importance of compassion and accountability, the multiple layers of impact of trust in organizations, setting boundaries and creating team buy-in, who gets a seat at your table, and creating a safe table, as well as so much more. I am very excited to share this interview with you, so without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. Welcome, Marissa. I am so excited to have you here on Unlimited today.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with just a little bit about what brought you here. What has motivated you doing the work that you do?
Yeah, I have a background in social work, but with a very specific concentration in organizational and leadership development, and spent a long time doing that professionally. And like many people, found myself very burnt out and dissatisfied with my professional life. And that burnout was profound at certain moments and translated to huge physical and psychological challenges in my life. And at some point a few years ago, I realized that there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way for me to interact with the world of work without having to work 70 hours a week or martyr myself for causes that I really believed in, but that were slowly killing me because I didn't have the support that I needed. And there had to be a better way for organizations in general to manage teams, to build culture, to create sustainable leadership for the leaders, but also for the people who are being led. And I wound up having to quit my job without a plan. And that was not part of my plan. I'm very much a person who likes a plan. I left in early 2019 to really focus on healing. I did a lot of work with a coach, did a lot of work with a therapist, and realized that for me, re-entering the traditional workforce wasn't going to be the most authentic manifestation of my gifts and what I was supposed to be doing in the world. And realized that at that time, and it still continues to be, my mission is to help prevent what happened to me in workplaces from happening to other people. So the fall of 2019, I started Revolution. So that's love in the center of the revolution. And we are on a mission to transform the world of work for good. And that means lots of things. And I'm sure we'll talk about lots of them.
Yes, I think we will, because that is exactly what I love and why I asked you to join me today, is because I think most of the people who are listening, and myself included, have experienced cultures in work that have been abusive. And not even necessarily intentionally abusive, but it's just part of our overall societal dynamics that make it this way. It's something that comes up with so many of the people that I work with around finding, and I've talked about this, the work-life balance thing, which really doesn't exist. And it's such a false dichotomy to say work-life balance. And so to help reframe that concept, to reframe the relationship of individuals to work and work to individuals, I'm really curious, what do you notice is attracting people to what you do? Both because I think there are individuals who might want to advocate for that in their work, and then there may be leaders who are listening who are like, we need more of that, but they haven't been able to think about it in the way that realizes there's options out there.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in terms of marketing, nobody comes out and says, my culture is horrible. Come help me fix it. There's a lot of shame built into this work. And so the early conversations that I have with clients are a lot more nuanced. I am happy to go there, but I first want to say that one of the biggest learnings from my first few months of being out of the workforce, when I was really doing that intentional healing time, was I had felt so alone. And it felt like this is only happening to me. And I am not strong enough. And I can't believe that I am not able to do the work that so many other people are doing. And in those first few months, I realized how not alone I was and how not unique my story was. And that's part of what fuels me. So if you're listening to this and you're resonating with this story, you're not alone. And there are things out there that can help you and can help your team and can help your company do better.
Yes.
And if your company or team or organizational structure doesn't permit that, you are allowed to choose yourself. So I just want to start there because that feels really important to name.
I want to express appreciation for you naming that, because I do think that is one of the big things in the over-individualized society where we are told so often that it is you, like even just with our terminologies, like imposter syndrome, making it about a you problem instead of a cultural problem, a societal problem, a systemic problem. So many of these things, they're not just happening to you because we're not made to function in the way that we are being expected to function.
Yeah. And the system is designed to make people into robots, to make people feel small. And there is an alternative. It takes a lot of work. It can be really uncomfortable, but I have seen it work, which I'm happy to share more about. Before I get there, I talk a lot about systems and leadership and we are all victims of this. So the most terrible boss in the world has been conditioned to be that way through generations and generations and generations. And there's a lot of unlearning we need to do. So to get to your question, when people come to me, oftentimes it's about our leaders don't know what they're doing, or our managers don't have the skills that they need in order to manage people. I hear a lot about multi-generational challenges. So these millennials are so lazy, or these Gen Zers are so entitled, and how dare they question the way we do things? And on the flip side, a lot about older people and how they're out of touch. And we need to see each other and recognize that everybody just wants to feel valued. And that is actually quite simple. And so when I go into a workplace, that's the first thing that we look at is, how do people feel valued? How do they want to feel valued? And where are the gaps? And really, really targeting that first, because ultimately it's what matters most to us. People want to feel seen and heard. They want to feel like they're not alone on their island working through and trudging through. They want to feel like they belong. And before you use the word abusive, and there are lots of words, right? Like workplaces can be abusive. I've seen lots of abusive workplaces. Workplaces can be toxic. They can be discriminatory and have lots of bias. There can be harassment involved. Cultures can also be really lukewarm. A lot of the time, that's actually what I see when I walk in, is that there isn't a culture to begin with. So people are left to their own devices to do what they think is right in terms of leading, in terms of building teams and building relationships. And that creates silos. It creates environments where people aren't seeing and talking to each other in the ways that we know are most effective. And one of the trickiest things is that every workplace is an ecosystem with unique human beings. And culture allows us to know the human beings that are right for that space. And not everybody is right for every space. And that's okay, as long as we're not being racist or sexist or homophobic or infusing isms into it. It's okay if your workplace isn't designed for everyone, but let people know what they're buying into. Let people know what's expected of them to begin with, so that they can decide for themselves whether this is a place that they belong or can belong. And that feels really important.
When you describe that, I think that is a really important distinction, because we don't need to belong everywhere. And so much of the structures of the ways that we learn to think about the world are embedded with biases that are rooted in things like patriarchy and white supremacy, and built through generations, as you said. Like, these are all things that we have to actively work to unlearn. Otherwise, they will naturally feed into a workplace culture or any space that we occupy, and will, I'm going to use the term infect it, because I feel like it's appropriate, or, well, it's already usually there. So it's like, we need antidotes. We need to do the work. I'm curious, what are some of those pillars of a healthy work culture that maybe not everybody has to fit into, but like that create a foundation that is healthy?
Yeah, I could talk for days about this. So I'm going to give the very short Cliff Notes version, and then folks can follow up with me or Val if that's helpful. I love that you use the word infection, because I use that metaphor quite frequently, that at Revolution, we treat the infections within work culture with antibiotics rather than painkillers or Band-Aids. And a lot of consultants out there, a lot of people who claim to or do focus on this work, a lot of it is Band-Aid fixes. And how do we make this look pretty to the outside world without actually digging into what the root causes are? What's causing that infection? And the way that we do that is through our pillars. So my philosophy is that organizations and leadership that are grounded in compassion, community, and heart are going to be more effective at large. Community is, again, that ecosystem, recognizing that we all interact within this space together, and we each have a part to play, and we need to know the relationship of our parts to each other. Compassion is the motivation to relieve the suffering of other people, which goes beyond kindness. And workplaces might be really good at being kind. We send the flowers when a family member dies, and maybe not as equipped to actually address the emotional suffering a person might be experiencing when they have experienced a loss in their lives. And so that goes along with making sure that leaders have trauma-informed lenses and they know what happens when people are experiencing grief and loss and how to address that while still holding accountability, which is really, really important to me. We talk a lot about love and compassion, which a lot of people see as mushy, gushy words. But for me, love and compassion in the absence of accountability and high expectations means chaos. We can't exist in a world where one of those doesn't exist.
I've heard it say, love can't exist long without the dimension of justice.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. And so then HEART for us is an acronym. So it stands for humanity, empathy, authenticity, relationships, and trust. And I could lead a 3-hour workshop on each of those constructs and do as a part of my work. So humanity that's where our DEI stuff comes in, really recognizing that each individual that makes up a workplace has their own unique story, their own strengths, their own flaws, their own limitations. And our job is to figure out how to use that and center that humanity in everything that we do. Empathy is a cousin to compassion. So really thinking about how we can imagine what someone else's experience might be like, recognizing that we can't necessarily ever experience what they're going through, but that we can imagine what it might be like and carry empathy towards people who have struggles that we do not have.
And we can listen and believe them when they tell us what their experience is.
Exactly. And then intervene, right? It's
Yes.
not just the listening and affirmation. It's then how do I use my privilege to intervene and take action? And that's where compassion comes in. It's much more action oriented, perhaps, than empathy unto itself. Authenticity, I believe really strongly that people should be able to show up as themselves. And again, that's something that's much harder for some people of some identities than other places. And so if you're listening to this, don't be authentic if it's not safe. My job is to help create the space where you can be authentic, where people have this tools and knowledge and cultural competence to be able to work with people who are different than they are. That's the ideal, but we're very far from the ideal right now. But I do teach a lot about how you can show up as your authentic self and decide which masks you need to wear to preserve your safety and which ones feel scratchy and itchy and you just want to release. And then also on the other side, like how can leaders help their people show up more authentically? So there's that flip side on both sides. Relationships is all about making sure that people know each other, not just for what they do, not just for their title or their role, but for who they truly are as human beings in this world. So you see it connecting to the other buckets. And then trust is honestly probably my favorite one because it's traditionally a really subjective topic. And it's not subjective at all. We get into trouble with trust when we make it subjective and about our gut impulse to trust or not trust somebody. But there are really concrete things that make a person trustworthy or untrustworthy. And if we can start diagnosing those and see where trust is truly breaking down on an individual level, on a culture level, and on a leadership level, and at an organizational level, there's so much work to be done there. And that's often one of the first places I start with companies.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it makes a lot of sense, especially with the things that seem amorphous, when we can give them some tangibility, when we can make them clearer. Because so often, so many of these things come from that gut feeling, that reactive feeling that's very much informed by all of our past experiences, as well as generational information that may not be accurate, may be based in past traumas, that are those survival mode things that get hijacked and utilized to perpetuate issues in our world. So to be able to go, okay, these things are real. They're present for you. They're experiences that are important to honor. And we do also need to create clarity around what is in the present moment and what are you trying to create so that you have something tangible to build from. So having those pieces is really helpful. And it makes me think about the idea of boundaries, because, you talk about relationships and the idea of value. At the beginning, you were saying about knowing what people value, how they want to be valued, what that looks like. And so much of how we articulate that has to do with boundaries and how we show who we are in our authentic way, which might not be sharing everything, as you were saying. Like, it could be, I can show up authentically without being like, this is all of me all the time in every way. Like, we don't need to post everything about our lives on social media to show up on social media authentically for those people who utilize that for business. What does it look like when you're talking to individuals and to companies and leaders in companies around that idea of setting boundaries? Because I found that most people do not understand boundaries at all.
Yeah. And that it goes to the point that you just made, that they're amorphous. It's a word we throw around that also is a way that we gaslight people. Just set better boundaries and everything will be fine.
It's all you.
Yeah. And again, like, our systems are not designed for people to put boundaries up. I knew that it was time for me to leave my last job because I was working with a coach and with a therapist and literally spending hours practicing how to advocate for myself and set better boundaries. And the second that I started saying no or pushing back, my boss did not like that very much. And you know what? It was not good for the programs that we were running and the outcomes we were trying to achieve. It was good for me. It was what needed to happen so that I did not shrivel up and die. But there is an impact when we start setting boundaries and people think differently about you. And there's so much there and so much personal baggage that I carry and resentment. No is a full sentence. If I tell you that I can't do this because I have already worked 60 hours this week, or because I'm so emotionally exhausted from the work that I have done, leaders need to trust that and not just tack on, oh, well, this entitled lazy millennial isn't willing to work hard. Nobody could ever say I wasn't working hard, but that's how I was made to feel. So in terms of boundaries, just in general, making them not amorphous has been really helpful to me. So boundaries aren't just one sort of thing. We have boundaries around time. I struggle with time boundaries, but I have really rigid time boundaries now at this point in my life. No email after 6 p.m. ever. It goes off of my phone. I do not facilitate in the evenings unless there's a really, really good reason. Those are things that I have built in as really rigid. But we also have things that are harder. So there are relationship boundaries and intellectual boundaries and emotional boundaries. There are physical boundaries, and then just really generic ones like, no, thank you. Or just saying like, this is not right for me right now, or I don't feel comfortable with this. And people get really uncomfortable when you start to set them. One of the things I tell my clients is that you can't control other people's feelings and reactions to you. In a work context, that's much harder because there are power dynamics that make it difficult. This person has control over whether you have a job right now or a paycheck. And so it might feel like it's impossible to set a boundary because it's not worth risking that, which is why I like to take the onus off of individuals and help organizations at large or teams at large think about, what do boundaries look like in our context? Which of those categories of boundaries do we as a team really struggle with? And what do we need to put in place to prevent ourselves from forgetting the boundaries that we need? And also helping each other maintain those boundaries, because accountability is really important. So when I was managing a team, if I got an email at 9 p.m. from a staff member, I was like, no. We've decided that's not something we're doing. Let's talk about why you're still working at 9 p.m. And there might be really good reasons, right? Well, I didn't get to work earlier, so I was catching up. fine. But we have to call it out when we see it and support each other. And it's much easier at a workplace level to do that when the whole team is bought into the process. And that's some of my favorite work to do.
That makes a lot of sense because, as you said, we only have so much power as individuals, and it really is important to have that environment. So being able to have that conversation, because boundaries help all of us, because when we have boundaries, we show up better because we have that container for ourselves. I always think about boundaries in that way of like, this is my me container. This is where I end and somebody else begins. This is what I have responsibility for. This is where I have control, and I can set those spaces. And it's interesting because, you know, there are other things that go along with that of like, you were saying how people get reactive, like when you start setting boundaries and they're like, oh my gosh, you're setting boundaries. They don't say it like that, but you know, there's usually a pushback because you're changing their expectations. They've come to be used to you behaving a certain way. And when you change, you force them to change, and change is uncomfortable. And so it's one thing when you choose it, it can still be uncomfortable. But then when somebody else chooses it for you, it's that much more uncomfortable. And it can actually feel like you're threatening them. The survival mode kicks in. You're threatening me by changing the dynamics of our relationship because you're threatening the relationship by changing the dynamics of it.
Yeah. And I would say that it's actually a little bit more than that. You're not just threatening me, you're threatening the status quo.
Yes.
And we rely on the status quo to be able to just get through the world.
Well, it's how we know how we're oriented in the world.
Mm-hmm. But there are parts of the status quo that are highly problematic. And I encourage people to say to their bosses something along the lines of, listen, I was talking with my coach this week and I need to get better at setting time boundaries. Here are some things that I have come up with. Does this feel realistic for our team and environment right now? Can you help me? And make them a partner in that rather than just, that's where I went wrong. I didn't do that. I just all of a sudden started setting boundaries. And in hindsight, I can see that was probably like being like ice water being poured over some of my colleagues and supervisors. Like, wait, but you've been doing this for 4 years. What do you mean you're not going to do that anymore? And yeah, so give yourself permission to say, this is something I'm working on. Can we work on it together? So it's not a complete shock to the system and doesn't derail things that are already happening.
It's really helpful in personal relationships too, especially. And like you were describing, will indicate, you know, the people that you can have more flexible boundaries with, or the ones you need more rigid boundaries with, based on how they show up to you setting boundaries. Mm-hmm. Is there an acceptance of that? Are they, maybe there's an initial reaction, but like, are they going with it? Are they having communication? Because if it's not and things are getting shut down, then that might not be a place you belong anymore, because maybe the culture isn't a fit. Or maybe they should call Marissa.
Well, I think that it's just so important to remember that not everyone deserves a seat at your table. And once I started owning that I actually even had a table that other people were sitting at, and that I had power and autonomy, even when it did not feel like I had power and autonomy, that started changing things for me. And I have lost relationships and opportunities, and even with clients or partners where they're not okay with the boundaries that I set. I had a situation a couple of years ago where there were crunch time on a project, and my contract really clearly states I do not work on weekends. And when the time came that there was time on the weekend, I sent an email on the Friday and said, just a reminder, I'll be tuning back in at 8 a.m. on Monday. Let me know where you'd like me to pick up. They did not like that at all. And it wound up ending that relationship. And I'm okay with that, because that's not how I want to exist in this world anymore. And I get to make that choice. And there are sacrifices that go along with that. And they're really, really hard sacrifices. Sometimes they're financial sacrifices if you're talking about a job, but you do not need to sit at a table where you are unsafe. And I do not need to invite people to the table that make me feel unsafe. or who regularly show up and haven't proven that they deserve a space in my orbit. That sounds so awful, but it's also it's true.
Yeah, I think it's awkward because we are taught that we are not supposed to do that. And it's also been utilized in ways that are really harmful as well. So it's really awkward. There's so many nuances to it that we have to look at, which is that constant work of okay, who am I allowing at my table? And what does it mean to feel unsafe? Is it triggering things that I'm having trouble looking at that I don't want to see within myself? Places where I've been called in for doing something that was harmful. And there's a difference between harm and hurt. So being able to look at that and going, okay, this is something I need to sit with. But it's also maybe I need to not have a space at the table until I do some work around this, because otherwise I'm going to be come to my table, and then I'm going to be an unsafe table. Right. So it's so important to recognize that we have this self that is valid and important and valuable and deserves to be treated with care. And everybody else has that too.
Yeah. I have set up a mental guidepost in my head where when I feel uncomfortable or unsafe, the first question I ask myself is, what of this is within my control? And sometimes there is a lot, and sometimes there's very little. And recognizing that I'm not going to be perfect, but yeah, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work I need to do to know that other people can come to me and that I'm going to be able to offer a safe space for them, and that I am not gaslighting other people into making it their problem and their work to do when I'm being triggered by things from my past that have absolutely nothing to do with them and it's totally outside of our context. You commented on a LinkedIn post of mine a few days ago where I had a client reach out to me and they just asked me a one sentence email, which I don't like. And there are a lot of things that I think could have been done differently. But all the email said was, do you have time to talk next week? And my lived experience started going, danger, danger, danger. That means it's we need to talk in a relationship. It's what did I do wrong was the first thing that I thought of. And that was me work. That person did nothing wrong. There are things they could have done differently to help my response. And that person didn't do anything wrong. They just asked me if I had time to talk. I needed to do a lot of reflection on what was coming up for me so that I could navigate that conversation. And it turned out to be a really, really good thing, not a really, really bad thing. So being open to recognizing where you're getting in your own way is a huge part of this.
Yeah. And as you were saying before, also about recognizing as a leader, the things that you can do to notice and acknowledge dynamics that are present for people that can influence and usually do influence our reactions, so that we're mindful of that when we engage, because your reaction is a very common reaction, right? That's something that you probably run into. I mean, all the points that you gave for leadership were spot on and so helpful, because they're things that really do come up for people. Our brains have a negative bias, for example. So it's natural that we're going to do that. A lot of us have experienced toxic workplaces that did mean that, or relationships that did mean that. So to be able to be aware of that and feed that into how you show up is so important.
Yeah. So we run a community called the Millennial Manager Collective, and one of our members was a part of the big tech layoffs over the last several months and wound up getting a job fairly quickly. And then that tech startup did layoffs, and they were much smaller scale and they were different, and she herself was not impacted. And that leader, the CEO of that company, reached out to her and said, I can imagine this is really hard for you given what you just experienced. Let me know if you need to talk about it or need any additional information. And that's so powerful, right? That's the difference between someone freaking out and being in terror that they are in jeopardy in the same way that they were in jeopardy previously, and somebody who's really conscious of what might be happening for their people and wanting to take care of that person in a really individual way. And I really don't think there's any way to do this without doing that. And I just think it's a beautiful anecdote. I encouraged her to write a blog about it. Maybe someday we can link to it.
Yeah. Those kinds of conversations and the ways that we show up create the space where we can show up like that for other people. So it's not just you taking care of everybody as a leader, but you creating a space where people are paying attention to each other. And that's so important. And I love the Millennial Manager Collective and what you've created there, because it's such an important space for people, not necessarily within a company, but for people who are in leadership positions, because so often companies don't give support for people. They're just like, oh, you're doing really well in the job. Here, be a leader. And you're like, what do I do?
Oh, it's a whole other podcast.
I know, right? It is. Absolutely. I was one of those people and I was surrounded by those people. So like to have a space where as leaders, you can connect and community and work on these things is really important, not just as individuals with a coach, which is great and helpful and something we both do, and to be able to have a space where you're connecting with other people. So with that, I'd love for you to share just a little bit about how people can work with you or connect with you if there are people who are either in companies who they're like, yes, we need Real Evolution to come in and do some work here. I want to advocate for that. Or maybe they're a new leader. What are the multiple ways that people can connect and get support?
Yeah. So in the show notes, there will be a link to be able to book an exploratory connection call with me. And so if that's of interest and you want to take some time to just talk about this episode and what came up for you and how I might be able to help, I would be happy to do that. I have really good boundaries around that. So you shouldn't feel bad just booking that call, even if you don't have any idea what you want to talk about. Let's chat. You can visit our website at www.truerealevolution.com. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can reach out to Val. We talk all the time, and I'm sure she can put you in touch with me.
Absolutely. I do some coaching work for you through Real Evolution and for the MMC. So definitely also same for me with my exploration call. I say this every episode, but yes, as well, I do have good boundaries around this. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And I highly recommend, if you are on LinkedIn, following Marissa, because she has some really awesome insights in her posts. I love reading everything that you write. It's just so good. I'm like, yes.
Sometimes I don't know if anybody sees them, so it's nice to hear that. Thank you.
I see them. I see them and I really like them. So I love to wrap up with 2 questions. First being, what does it mean to you to be unlimited?
Yeah. So to be unlimited is to be able to show up radically and authentically as the human being that I was put on this earth to be, and to have the privilege of using my light to light other people up.
I love it. And when you want to feel that sense of unlimitedness, what song do you listen to?
Yeah. So Rachel Patton's Fight Song, which is some of the lyrics are, "This is my fight song, take back my life song, prove I'm all right song." And that is one that gets blasted regularly in my car, at my computer, on walks, before difficult conversations. It's all about reclaiming yourself and owning your power. And it motivates me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to connecting again soon.
Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.